Margaret Thompson's hands are still shaking as she tells her story. 30 years have passed, but her fear hasn't faded. I knew what would happen to me if I spoke out, she says. But now I'm old. I have nothing left to fear. What happened that night at the hospital that the government covered up so thoroughly? Which powerful figures were involved? And most importantly, how many people took this secret to their graves? I'm Michael Carter. I've been an investigative journalist for 25 years. Today, sitting across from me is 78-year-old retired nurse Margaret Thompson. She's holding an old file. She's about to tell a story she's kept secret for 30 years. It was 1993. I was head nurse at Chicago General Hospital. I was working the night shift on November 15th. At exactly 11:30 p.m., ambulances started arriving. But these weren't normal ambulances. Margaret pauses. There's still fear in her eyes. The ambulances had no license plates. They were black vehicles. And the patients they brought, these weren't normal patients. They brought 7 people that night, all men, ages 25-40. But the strange thing was, none of them had identification, no names. They were just given numbers. Patient 1, Patient 2, Patient 3. Margaret pulls out an old record from her file. These are the notes I took that night. I kept them secretly, because something was very wrong. These patients were severely injured, but the men who came with the ambulances weren't hospital staff. They were men in suits wearing dark sunglasses. Patient 3 was the most severely injured. He'd been shot in the head. As we wheeled him to the operating room, he was mumbling unconsciously. It wasn't English he was speaking. It sounded like Arabic. Margaret's voice trembles. Dr. Robert Wilson operated on him. The surgery lasted 4 hours, but the patient died on the operating table. When Dr. Wilson came out, his face was completely white. "Margaret," he said, "nothing happened tonight. Do you understand? Nothing happened." The next morning, hospital director Mr. James Harrison came to see me. He had 2 men with him. "Margaret," he said, "there will be no record of last night's events. You saw nothing. You know nothing." Margaret pulls out a photograph from her file. "I secretly took this photo. It shows the bodies being removed from the operating room." But the truly horrific thing was, these bodies weren't taken to the hospital morgue. They were taken away in the same black vehicles. 3 days later, I got a phone call at home. The voice was unfamiliar. "Margaret," it said, "you're a very good nurse. You should continue living peacefully with your family. But remember, some things never happened." Margaret's hands are shaking. That's when I realized this was something very big. I talked to my husband. "Stay quiet," he said. "Think about your family." And I stayed quiet. For 30 years I stayed quiet. But I had saved the notes I took that night. The hospital records were deleted, but everything was in my notebook. Which patient came in what condition, who operated, who I spoke with. She pulls out more documents from the file. "This is the surgical report Dr. Wilson wrote that night. I secretly copied it. Here he talks about bullet fragments in patient 3's head. But the strange thing is, the report says this bullet is NATO standard. During that period, very strange cases were coming to our hospital. There were operations happening overseas. But these patients were different. They weren't American soldiers. There was nothing in their identification." Margaret pauses. "One night I caught Dr. Wilson alone. 'Doctor,' I said, 'who are these patients?' He was very scared too. 'Margaret,' he said, 'these are secret agents involved in international operations. But you know nothing.' Years later, I understood that very secret operations were being conducted in America during that period. Not just our hospital, but 3-4 hospitals in Chicago were receiving these mysterious patients." She shows the documents. "I found this list much later, a list of foreign agents who came to America during that period. There were people from CIA, NSA, even Israeli Mossad. Overseas operations were the excuse, but something completely different was really happening. For 30 years I couldn't tell anyone. At night I would see those bodies in my dreams. I would see those ambulances." Dr. Wilson died of a heart attack 2 years later. He was a young man, only 45 years old. Her eyes fill with tears. Hospital director Harrison also died in a car accident 3 years later. Coincidence? I don't know, but everyone who knew about that night died one by one. I'm 78 years old now. I have grandchildren. I don't have the right to take this secret to my grave. Other people should know too. What happened at the hospital that night? What dirty games were being played in America? She closes the file. Maybe I'm too late, but at least someone should know. Those who died deserve it too. People should know who they were. A lot happens in this country that we don't know about. In hospitals, in government offices, in military units. We're just pawns in this big game. Margaret stands up. I served the state for 45 years, but what I saw that night really shook me. Now I want everyone to know. History should write the truth. Tonight you've heard the 30-year secret of 78-year-old retired nurse Margaret Thompson. Are the documents in her hands real? What really happened at the hospital that night? And how many more people are keeping secrets like this? These questions didn't just ease Margaret's conscience. Maybe they also shed light on America's dark history. Next week we'll hear another witness's story, another secret, because truths come out sooner or later, and we're searching for those truths. After that phone call, I knew I had to be more careful. Margaret continues, her voice steadying as she delves deeper into her memories. But I also knew I couldn't just forget what I'd seen, so I started keeping a secret diary. She opens another section of her file, revealing pages of handwritten notes. Every suspicious incident that happened at the hospital after that night, I wrote it down, and there were many more incidents. This wasn't a one-time thing. Over the next 6 months, similar scenes played out at least 12 more times. Always at night, always the same black vehicles, always patients with no identification. But I started noticing patterns. Margaret spreads out a hand-drawn chart. Look at these dates. November 15th, December 3rd, December 18th, January 7th, January 22nd. They weren't random, there was a schedule to this madness. She points to specific entries in her diary. And the patients weren't just Americans. I heard different languages, Russian, what sounded like German, definitely Arabic, and some Eastern European languages I couldn't identify. Chicago General was becoming some kind of international medical station for covert operations. The most terrifying discovery came 3 months later, in February 1994. I was working a double shift because we were short-staffed. Around 2 a.m., I went down to the morgue to retrieve some medical supplies we'd stored there temporarily. Margaret's hands began to tremble again. The morgue should have been empty except for Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who died earlier that day from natural causes. But when I opened the door, I saw 3 body bags that weren't supposed to be there. She pauses, collecting herself. I shouldn't have looked, but curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped one of the bags slightly. The body inside was that of a young man, maybe 25 years old. But his face, it looked like he'd been tortured. There were burn marks, cuts that were too precise to be from any accident. That same night, as I was leaving the morgue area, I noticed something I'd never seen before. There was a service corridor I'd walked past hundreds of times, but this time the maintenance door was slightly open. Margaret pulls out a rough sketch she'd made. I followed the corridor and discovered it led to an underground tunnel system I never knew existed. The tunnel connected our hospital to a building 2 blocks away. A building I later learned was a government office. Her voice drops to almost a whisper. I could hear voices coming from deeper in the tunnel, voices speaking in what sounded like multiple languages. I didn't dare go further, but I realized this explained how they were moving bodies and patients without anyone seeing them on the street. Dr. Wilson started changing after that November night. He'd always been confident, professional, but by spring of 1994, he was drinking heavily. I could smell alcohol on him during his shifts. Margaret shows a photo of Dr. Wilson from the hospital newsletter. One night in March, I found him crying in the supply closet. "Margaret," he said, "I didn't become a doctor to be part of this. I became a doctor to save lives, not to help them cover up what they're doing to people." She wipes her eyes. He told me things that night that I wish I'd never heard. He said the patients weren't just being treated. Some were being used for medical experiments, drug testing, surgical procedures that weren't meant to heal but to extract information or test new torture techniques. Dr. Wilson also told me something that explained everything. He said our hospital had been selected as part of a network of medical facilities across the country that were secretly cooperating with international intelligence agencies. Margaret shows a list she'd compiled. He mentioned hospitals in New York, Los Angeles, Miami, even some in Canada and Mexico, all part of what he called black site medical support. Places where operatives could receive treatment without questions, where enemies could be held and interrogated using medical cover. The genius of it was the cover story. To the outside world, we were just treating victims of overseas conflicts, providing humanitarian medical care. The paperwork all looked legitimate, but the reality was much darker. She pulls out what appears to be an official-looking document. This is a memo I found in Dr. Wilson's office after he died. It outlines something called Operation Medical Sanctuary. The goal was to create a network of medical facilities that could support covert operations while maintaining complete deniability. But it gets worse.
I discovered that some of the patients weren't just being treated, they were being used to test experimental drugs, drugs that weren't approved by the FDA, drugs that were being developed for military applications. Margaret's voice becomes more urgent. I saw patients who came in with minor injuries but were given medications that seemed to affect their mental state. Some became extremely agitated, others became completely docile. It was like they were testing different forms of chemical interrogation. The incident that finally broke my silence happened in April 1994. A young woman was brought in, couldn't have been more than 20 years old. She was conscious, speaking what sounded like Russian, and she was terrified. Margaret's voice cracks with emotion. I tried to comfort her, but the men in suits pulled me away. They took her to a room in the basement that I'd never seen used before. I could hear her screaming for hours. The next morning they told me she died during surgery. But I knew better. That's when I decided I had to start gathering real evidence. I began secretly photographing documents, copying files, even recording conversations when I could. She shows a collection of photographs and documents. This photograph shows bodies being loaded into refrigerated trucks instead of the morgue. This document is a supply order for surgical equipment that's typically used for interrogation, not medical treatment. In this recording, she holds up an old cassette tape, contains a conversation between Dr. Wilson and one of the government handlers. On this tape you can hear them discussing quotas for how many subjects they needed to process each month. They talk about these human beings like their inventory in a warehouse. Margaret's anger is palpable now. Dr. Wilson asks about the ethics of what they're doing, and the handler tells him that ethics are a luxury they can't afford in the war against terrorism. This was 1994, remember, before 9/11, before the war on terror as we know it. But they were already using that justification. When Dr. Wilson died in 1995, I knew it wasn't natural. A healthy 45-year-old man doesn't just have a heart attack. And when Director Harrison died in a car accident in 1996, I knew they were cleaning house. She shows newspaper clippings of both deaths. But they made a mistake with me. I think they assumed that because I was just a nurse, I wasn't smart enough to be a real threat. They underestimated how much I had seen and remembered. For 30 years I've lived with this knowledge. I've watched as our country has gone through various conflicts and wondered how many other hospitals, how many other medical professionals have been drawn into this shadow world. Margaret looks directly at the camera. I've seen the news about torture sites, about black sites operated by the CIA, and I know that what I witnessed was part of that same system. We weren't just treating agents, we were part of the torture apparatus itself. I'm speaking now because I'm dying. Lung cancer, stage 4. I have maybe 6 months left. And I can't take this secret with me to the grave. Her resolve strengthens, but also because I think the American people deserve to know what was done in their name, in their hospitals, by their government. We have a right to know how our medical institutions were corrupted and used for purposes that violate every principle of medical ethics. Everything I've shown you tonight is just a fraction of what I've kept. I have over 200 photographs, dozens of documents, hours of recorded conversations. I've made copies and stored them in multiple locations. Margaret closes her file. I've also prepared detailed testimony that I've given to a lawyer, with instructions that it be released to the media and to Congress if anything happens to me before my natural death. I'm not asking people to just take my word for this. I'm asking for a real investigation. Bring in the FBI, bring in Congress, bring in international human rights organizations. Examine the evidence. Interview other hospital staff from that period who might still be alive. Her voice grows stronger. Chicago General isn't the only place this happened. There are other nurses, other doctors, other hospital workers who know things. My speaking out might give them the courage to come forward too. To any government officials who might be watching this, I know you'll try to discredit me. You'll say I'm a confused old woman, that I'm making things up. But I have the evidence, and more importantly, I have nothing left to lose. Margaret stands up one final time. To the families of those young people who disappeared into this system, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I'm sorry I was too afraid to risk my own life to try to save theirs. But I'm speaking now, and I hope it's not too late for justice. As our interview concludes, Margaret Thompson packs away her files with the careful precision of someone who has spent decades protecting dangerous secrets. Her story raises disturbing questions about the intersection of medical care and covert operations in America. Is this the testimony of a brave whistleblower finally finding her voice, or the confused memories of an elderly woman facing her own mortality? The documents and photographs she's provided will require expert analysis to verify their authenticity. But one thing is certain, Margaret Thompson believes every word she's told us tonight, and if even half of what she's described is true, it represents a fundamental betrayal of medical ethics and human rights that deserves investigation. The truth, as they say, has a way of surfacing eventually. Tonight, thanks to the courage of a dying nurse, it may have taken one step closer to the